Lipids are another group of macromolecules, and lipids are mostly made of hydrogen and carbon, and remember we call molecules like that hydrocarbons. And because of that reason, their key feature is that they are nonpolar. That means they won't mix with water. They're insoluble in water. Lipids include three broad categories: fats, phospholipids, and steroids. Lipids are an example of macromolecule that is not a polymer, so there's not going to be a monomer that links together to make them. Fats are also known as triglycerides or triacylglycerols, and that's good to know because when you're looking at a food label, that's often how they will be hiding fat in the ingredient list from you. But be aware that that does mean that they've added, for example, soy fat or something like that. Fats have a basic structure where it's a glycerol molecule, and glycerol is a 3-carbon molecule, and it is illustrated here. And just for simplicity, I'll draw a little more simple version of it over here. And each one of the carbons on the glycerol is attached to, so just putting in this part here, a chain of carbons called a fatty acid. So each fat is a glycerol attached to 3 fatty acids. Fatty acids are really just long chains of carbon. So in this case, this here has 17, 18, 19 carbons. So it's just a chain of 19 carbons and hydrogens. And so again, remember that's lots and lots of carbon to hydrogen bonds and carbon to carbon bonds, which are nonpolar. And this is very, very long. Again, it's just sort of abbreviating it here, but if I were to draw that out, it would be very, very long. And I'll go ahead and just show you what I mean here. See, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19. So it's a very, very, very long series of carbons. And so the majority of the molecule, this very long part here, is hydrophobic. So this is the figure from your text showing the fatty acids drawn out again. And the reason why we're going to focus here on fatty acids is because there's really 2 types of fatty acids. And this is going to affect the properties of the molecule. So fatty acids can either be saturated or unsaturated. And maybe you recognize these terms from food labels. So saturated fats have all single carbon bonds. And so up here, this is an example of a saturated fatty acid, and you can see these black dots are carbon, and each one of these is a single bond. Unsaturated fats or fatty acids have some double bonds. And so if you look at this example of an unsaturated fatty acid, we can see a double bond here and a double bond here. Saturated fats are animal fats. So things like butter or the fat on a steak. Unsaturated is typically vegetable fats. So things like soybean oil, peanut oil, olive oil, are all examples of unsaturated fats. So the other key difference here, and if you think about olive oil versus butter, you would think of this probably as one of the key differences. Olive oil tends to be a liquid at room temperature. Saturated fats, and like butter, tend to be a solid at room temperature. So basically, the double bonds keep them in a more liquid form. So double bonds make them be more liquid. Having all single bonds makes them be more solid. And the As you get more and more double bonds, it makes it more and more liquid. As you get less double bonds, it makes it more and more solid. So if you think about that, you probably, maybe from experience, know that margarine is a little bit softer than butter, for example. And that's because margarine has some double bonds, or sorry, yes, margarine has some double bonds still, that's making it be softer, whereas butter has no double bonds, so it's a little more solid than the margarine. That brings me to another point that I didn't make earlier. So margarine, as you may know, or Crisco or oleo, these are all products that take vegetable oil, which is normally liquid, and using chemical processes, they convert it into a solid. The reason why they did this was they were trying to get Americans to eat less animal fat because they thought at the time that animal fat was a major contributor to heart disease. So they marketed these products as a way to reduce your risk of heart disease. One of the things that happened, though, was when they did this chemical conversion, right, they are trying to get rid of double bonds. So your vegetable oil, just draw it here, right, is going to have a series of double bonds in it. Okay, and again, the double bonds keep it liquid. Well, what they wanted to do was convert it to something with less double bonds. So maybe getting rid of that double bond right there, or reducing the number of double bonds. So notice this one has 2 double bonds, this one only has 1. So this one is going to be more solid than the original oil. What happened when they did this chemical process, though, is in vegetable oil, you always have cis double bonds. So in nature, you're always going to have the cis enantiomer. So notice that these hydrogens are on the same side, cis for same side. When they did the chemical reaction, they would end up with some double bonds that were trans. And so this is where trans fat comes from that you've probably heard about. So again, it doesn't occur in nature at all. It only occurs when they carry out this chemical reaction where they're trying to make something like margarine. Whoops, sorry about that. And so they realized later on, many years later, like 50 years after they'd started selling margarine, that if you looked at health studies, people who ate margarine actually were not getting less heart disease. In fact, they were getting more heart disease. And what they eventually realized was that this trans fat is actually really bad for you. So trans fat, having these double bonds on the opposite sides, does not normally occur in nature and is actually really bad for us. And so that's why there's been a movement to change the way that they make these products so that they don't make trans fat. They still make a tiny amount, and so if you look at the label on something that says 0 trans fat, like a margarine that says 0 trans fat, it'll say a little star, and it'll say that it's below this amount, because the chemical reaction that they do in the laboratory or in the factory to make it be solid can't entirely not have trans fat, even though, again, in nature, you always only see cis, because that's how specific biological living things are. So fats sometimes have a bad reputation, but in fact, they're very important for living things. The key function is for energy storage. So 1 gram of fat stores twice as much energy as 1 gram of glycogen or starch, these carbohydrate energy stores. And so this is a much more compact form of energy storage. And so again, this is especially important in animals that move. We need to have very compact energy storage. If you think about fats in plants, like olive oil or peanut oil or canola oil, you'll notice that the fat tends to be in seeds, and this really makes sense with this idea of movement. So seeds need to be very compact as well, because seeds are supposed to travel so that seed can give rise to a new plant somewhere else. So seeds also need a very compact energy storage, even though the rest of the plant might not. In a lot of other organisms, fats also provide cushioning and insulation. If you've ever done a dissection of like a mammal or something, or even a frog or something like that, you'll notice inside of the internal cavity there's generally a fair amount of fat in there, and it's not because the frog was fat, it's because we all have a certain amount of fat in our internal organ areas to help cushion them and protect them from just like bouncing up and down all the time. Fat also provides insulation. You've probably heard of this, really important things like bears and whales, helping them stay warm and maintain their body temperature. Phospholipids are another category of lipids. They're very similar structurally to fats. So they have the same base of glycerol. So there's the 3-carbon glycerol. They have 2 fatty acids. But instead of a 3rd fatty acid, they have a variable chemical region on the other carbon that is polar. So it's called the polar head group, and the key thing is that it's hydrophilic because it's polar, whereas this part of the molecule is hydrophobic. So remember, the term for being both hydrophobic and hydrophilic is amphipathic. So phospholipids are actually an amphipathic molecule. This part is the polar region, this is the nonpolar region. So like detergents that we talked about in micelles, they're going to want to orient themselves so that this part is in water and this part is away from water. This is going to be significant in membranes. So there's a whole chapter devoted to membranes, so we're going to spend a lot of time on membranes. But just as a brief overview, phospholipids will structure themselves into a bilayer. That means 2 layers, where this part is away from water, and this is the polar head groups, they're facing water. And this is how the boundary between the cell, so this might be the cell, and its environment will be maintained. Steroids are another class of lipids. Their defining feature is a series of carbon-hydrogen rings. So this is the structure here in its detail. It's often abbreviated just like this. So this is a steroid ring. Cholesterol has this. So this is cholesterol. There's the key ring, and then it has some other stuff on there. And then all the steroid hormones also have this, and ones that I know you know, testosterone, estrogen, are examples of steroid hormones. And again, they have that base carbon ring that makes them hydrophobic with various polar groups on there. And as we talked about earlier, these molecules, even though they only differ by functional groups, lead to significant changes biologically. Waxes are also in the lipid family and often serve as layers, a way to layer organisms or to block water, so protect. Like, for example, a leaf has a wax layer that helps it hold in moisture. Because it's hydrophobic, water can't pass through it. But we won't talk very much about waxes in the semester.